So my name is Dominique Leydet. I'm a professor of philosophy here at UQAM, and I'm the director for at least 2 days. 2 more days. 2 more days of the CRIDAQ, which is one of the sponsors. So I'm pleased to welcome Fiona Jenkins, who's a professor at Australian National University. And the title of her talk is Acknowledgment of Country and the Staging of History: Can Practices of Acknowledgment Alleviate Colonial Epistemic Oppression?
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to assume from the outset that you're fairly familiar with practices of acknowledgement of country, but I'll say a little bit about it. I know that in the Canadian context, this is something that's quite regularly performed, and we had an acknowledgement at the beginning of this conference from Amandine, who I thank for organising, and Belly for inviting me, both of you. It's been a real treat so far to be here. In Australia, I think it has become ubiquitous to the point of almost being like wallpaper, acknowledgements of country. And I mean, in fact, one of the differences that I've noticed between a conference like this here and one that would have been held in Australia, every speaker would have begun by acknowledging the country that we're on. And if you walked into a post office, you would see an acknowledgement of country on the wall. If you walked anywhere in the university, you would see acknowledgements on every electronic screen that there is. I was sort of taken by the ironies when I was flying into Sydney on the way here of descending over Botany Bay, which is the site Aboriginal people will speak of as the site of the invasion of Australia, and receiving an acknowledgement because we were coming into land, and obviously no awareness of any of the ironies of that kind of juxtaposition. And so part of what I'm going to talk about today is that sense perhaps of a practice in some disarray or decay, and what about it might be retrieved, what about it is problematic, what about it might be worthwhile. And how do we approach that through a lens which is both going to be one of looking at this through the lens of politics of recognition, and particularly the critique of politics of recognition, and also thinking about it in terms of epistemic oppression. And along the way, we're going to look at lots of lovely pictures, because this is part of a wider project I have called Arts of Acknowledgement, where I'm kind of trying to think about what happens if you insert artworks into the space of acknowledgement and what they help us to see and show us. Okay, so let's just some sort of basic things about acknowledgement. Acknowledgement, of course, is often accompanied by a welcome, and a welcome will be given by an elder of the land that you are on. And acknowledgement is often framed in terms of this land of traditional owners or traditional custodians. And sometimes, in addition to acknowledging the original custodians of the land that you're on, which you will name, you will also talk about the fact that this is unceded or stolen land. Typically, the corporate kind of versions of this don't do that. And I think it can also be one way in which people try to sort of, reinforce the seriousness and depth of the acknowledgement that's being given. And of course, there's a really important background to this in terms of the lands rights movement and certain concessions that have been won in the legal framework, in particular, the Mabo decision of 1992, which overturned the legal fiction of terra nullius in Australia. And that idea of the traditional custodians is a serious kind of reference to this establishment of native title. Now, alongside this framework, I just want to draw attention briefly to the kind of representation of Australia that corresponds to that. That's the top diagram, which is something that you would now see in every Australian school. It's a kind of division of the different lands of the many Aboriginal peoples of Australia, names given in terms of language groups. But what I want to draw your attention to is how it looks like parceled out territory, with a bit of a feel of what the map of Europe looks like, say. It's a very different kind of representation from what you might have if you're, for example, trying to represent songlines of Aboriginal Australia. And in terms of kind of what, these acknowledgements achieve, one of the things I want to mark in this paper is that I think it has opened the way to precisely a discussion and acknowledgement of these histories of Australia, including histories of violence. Below the map of the languages of Australia is a map that shows the site of massacres of Indigenous people, and that is again something that is only recently really filtering into Australian consciousness. So I'm trying to give a bit of a feel of where we're at. Now, one of the things that I've discovered in working on acknowledgement is that almost everybody feels really uncomfortable about it, really ambivalent, really a sense that you have to do it. And in fact, in a lot of contexts, it is required that you do it. And at our university, for example, it is required that you make an acknowledgement of country on multiple occasions, including at the start of a lecture series, or certainly opening a conference. As Karen was saying yesterday, it's required to be on your website. It's probably required to be in your email signature. There's a lot of things that now are marked in that way. And a lot of people feel very uncomfortable about it and yet do it. And I wanted to give the kind of this expression of disquiet to an Aboriginal woman, Megan Davis, who describes, I think, very well this feeling that on bad days to her, an acknowledgement assumes an elegiac form, a sorrowful lament by the stranger who knows only too well that they have taken your land. Whereas on good days, I feel pride that Australians are learning the name of the First Nation of the soil upon which they were born or arrived or work. And I think that captures well some of this sort of double sense there is about the space of acknowledgement. And there's a couple of other comments she makes in this piece, one of which is that she sees acknowledgement as being deeply inappropriate in certain contexts. And these include when it's brought into contact with ongoing racial injustices. So she, as a leading constitutional law professor, for example, chaired the Queensland Commission of Inquiry into Youth Detention Centres. And she describes how making an acknowledgement there in the context of bearing witness to the dehumanising and violent behaviour of corrections officers, the performance of acknowledgement would have been intolerable. And I think that's an interesting thing to notice, that although the violence of colonisation is marked, it is very much marked in the past. And there's a kind of, there would be something improper about bringing it into the present. Acknowledgement bears value only as the beginning of a serious political journey is the other thing that she reminds us of or expresses as her kind of feeling about acknowledgement. And so it makes sense as part of a progressive framework. And she notes that we shouldn't confuse voluntary gestures by private individuals with the institutional levels of recognition and structural political reform that are required to address persistent sources of conflict in Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations. So that, of course, is an agenda and a confidence and belief about where acknowledgement might fit into Australian political life that received a very severe blow in the 2023 referendum on a voice to Parliament. And that little map of Australia, there's going to be lots of maps of Australia, is showing you how widespread the no vote was in view of a constitutionally recognised Aboriginal voice to Parliament, which was what the referendum was trying to establish. So I think there's an interesting question there about when that aspect of structural reform, that aspect of progressive politics has failed, what is the role of acknowledgement now? That's a kind of theme that will run through my talk today. So why question acknowledgement? And that is an artist who's going to come along with us on some of this journey. Richard Bell is part of the Proper Now collective that makes very deliberately political art. I'll get to his kind of perspective on this in a moment. But I think there's lots of quite deep reasons for questioning acknowledgement that perhaps go beyond this kind of recent political failure. One that's raised by Francesca Merlin in this quote is that it's that whole background of recognition of land rights is tied to forms of cultural recognition that have proved extremely problematic for Aboriginal Australians in terms of claiming those land rights. And one of the reasons for that is that the standards for recognition of authentic identity in order to claim land rights are very high, and they are set by a mixture of kind of state sources and Indigenous people themselves. Merlin is really pointing to how that is carried over into the forms of identity that are recognised by acknowledgement. So just to take you back to my opening acknowledgement, in Canberra, we acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people who have rival claims, in fact, to the land of Canberra, and it is not a happy coexistence of claims, right? There's a lot of dispute around that. And the idea that, you know, Australia can be neatly parceled out into these peoples who are acknowledged doesn't actually do great justice to the kind of violent histories of assimilation, for example, that have been practiced in Australia over many years. This is a point that I think is strengthened in some of the work that I'll turn to in a moment by Glenn Courtauld, who has a very broad spread critique of the kind of politics of recognition. And I'll say a little bit in a moment about how he sees that perhaps intersecting with acknowledgement. But there are other things that we can say besides this. I mean, the very idea of custodial relation with a parcel of land, that's something I'll talk about in a moment as actually potentially doing great violence to this notion of country that we are acknowledging when we acknowledge country. That is a complex system of place-based normativity integrated with ideas of law and identity that may well be quite travestied when we think about territorial parcels of land. We've already noticed the worry about how we touch on, but somehow sort of bypass questions of violence, including ongoing aspects of settler colonial violence. And in particular, I think there's an issue, even when we try to talk about that, when we say something quite strong about the stolen or unceded lands that we're on, because of the way the ritual is structured, that typically goes without any immediate uptake in acknowledgement rituals. We are doing this to open an event or conversation, and we move on almost immediately. And one of the reasons I've put Richard Bell in here is I think that that's a lovely kind of version of a possible uptake of talking about being on stolen land. Okay, you can go now. Of course, the point he's making is actually a little bit more, it's more subtle again, because this work is called immigration policy. And so, of course, he's pointing to the way in which you can go now. You can go, go back to where you came from, which is a common, aspect and trope of Australia's sort of sense of self-identity and its politics. And of course, he's referencing that and then saying, no, actually, if that's your logic, you can go now. So I think, that question of uptake is really important and interesting. Another aspect that makes a lot of us really uncomfortable at acknowledgement sort of ceremonies is where this entails that there is some welcome, which is not to say that it's not wonderful to have an elder come and welcome. But there's so many paradoxes in your inviting the elder to come and welcome at your event, and it is like performatively extremely weird that is the space on which and then you take over the platform with your acknowledgement. It's very complicated how that is supposed to work, and I think there's an implication within that of a kind of consent that's being given. You don't invite an elder who's going to say, well, you're not welcome, right? That is not an option. And so there's a kind of tacit consent that is being required. And finally, I think there is a real danger that this relates back to the issue of the referendum, that it lulls us into a false sense of security about where we're at on our journey to justice. I mean, as a component of reconciliation. I think in many ways, this required repetition of the words functions as quite a forced kind of piece of evidence of an essentially just relationship between Indigenous people and the state. So it's problematic from that point of view. Okay, so Richard Bell once again has got a good way of thinking about this. I think there's a lot we can draw from the kind of critical work on the politics of recognition. And I've just drawn some stuff here from Glenn Cloutard, Red Skin, White Masks, obviously from a Canadian context, but so much of what he says translates really well into the Australian context. And there are, the main points he's making here are about the way in which, when we think about recognition, we always have to think about who's the recognizer and what their interests are in recognizing things in certain ways. So particularly his concern is how Indigenous cultural rights come to recognition in ways that actively block efforts to assert claims to Indigenous sovereignty or even alternative ways of life. There's quite a sort of capture involved in that idea of recognition of cultural rights on his account. Moreover, he is concerned with the temporality, if you like, of this gesture, the way in which it implies that somehow an era has ended, that we are now in the phase of acknowledgement. We can now recognize. In the absence of any kind of formal transition from an authoritarian to a democratic state, he's suggesting that this may be part of a kind of ideological transition that is manufactured by the state, which consigns abuses to the dustbin of history. It allows us to dissociate from ongoing processes of dispossession. Okay, so I've got 10 minutes left, so that's a little bit of a freaker. Epistemic oppression, I think the interesting overlaps with the politics of recognition, and perhaps, this is a kind of summary slide that, captures where I think we can draw on both the epistemic oppression literature and these, and both the kind of, I suppose, the positive version of the politics of recognition and these critiques. So I think there's a valid argument that in some respects and at a certain level, acknowledgement alleviates epistemic oppression. And you could talk here about the way in which it does challenge the denial of any significance to pre-colonial Indigenous inhabitation. It accords respects to the survival and achievement of Aboriginal cultures. You could say that it supports, in many respects, redressing testimonial hermeneutic injustice. So for example, we are prepared to hear about the massacres that occurred on the frontiers of Australia's settlement. We could even talk about it as a form of epistemic reparation, and I think there's mileage in all of these things, right? We can, if we want to argue that acknowledgement has alleviated epistemic oppression, there are places to go. But the counter argument that acknowledgement actually deepens epistemic oppression would draw a lot from the critique I just kind of outlined from Glenn Cloutard and others. So the idea that we are actually producing certain kinds of subjects of recognition, and these suit state and corporate ends, that we address Indigenous subjects who can consent and welcome us to country. We make country into land as property. We, in fact, maintain via recognition itself what are in many respects already epistemic damaged identities. So one of the things that I think might be interesting to unpack further here is the ways in which our recognition and the goods that it brings can actually be vehicles for deepening epistemic oppression in another sense. I think a lot will depend on what we want to say politically. A lot of the critique of recognition politics is because something more is being called for. Something more is being demanded. Now, I just want to spend a little bit of time with the corporate values kind of version of acknowledgement, because I think that's a really interesting space where we can see this kind of deepening of epistemic oppression in quite an interesting way. So this is, well, on the far left is an absolutely classic poster of the land rights movement. You are on Aboriginal land. That poster is completely iconic in terms of the land rights movement. And next to it, you can see something I discovered just before I left when I tried to enter the cybernetics website at ANU. And in order to enter that website, now it's quite common on a website to have this acknowledgement that you sort of click a little cross in the corner to make it disappear before you can enter the site. But this one actually invites you to say, I acknowledge, with a clicker as you go into the site. This again was from my journey here, the American Express lounge at Sydney Airport has this, and alongside it a commissioned artwork in which welcome takes on the form of a kind of road sign. And there's lots of interesting stuff here about, you know, these are all places where we're entering another kind of space, but what kind of space is it? I think it's a really interesting corporate space. And I think this is partly what's giving rise to some of my questions. I mean, I think these questions also have validity inside the kind of, if you like, the sort of purely civil sphere in which we are engaging with some kind of process of reconciliation. But what do they mean when they take on this very corporate inflection? And I just want to test that a little bit through the lens of, am I down to 5 minutes as well?
In 1 minute.
Oh, okay. Through the lens of this statement that was made by Rio Tinto, who you may know in 2020 destroyed the UQAM caves, which were a really important heritage site for Aboriginal people, which just happened to contain artworks that were about 46,000 years old. And this destruction was actually legal. It was authorised by the Western Australian government. To some extent, it was with the acceptance of certain Aboriginal groups. And yeah, it obviously raised a huge outcry nationally and internationally. It was deemed to have gone too far in terms of destruction of country. And I think it's interesting to think about this as a value statement that has a certain kind of form that's continuous with these corporate acknowledgement structures. So it is an accountability framework that is being articulated here. It is an apology in a certain sense that's being articulated here. But it has a very interesting temporality. It's largely self-referential. It's a framework for regarding actions, but the standards it avows are assumed to already exist as standards, when actually they're obviously calibrated after the fact in view of public opinion. And even if they are assumed in advance by companies, you can expect that that is what's driving them. What can we get away with? So the idea that this was an aberration, not a norm, we need to be assumed to have good intentions. We know it will take time to rebuild trust, but you should trust us. There's a kind of foregrounding of the values that are supposed to protect against actual investigation of the conditions under which this was both possible and legal for Rio Tinto to do. And finally, it kind of enfolds Indigenous people as partners, necessarily partners in pursuing both mining and cultural heritage. Now, luckily, we have a wonderful critique of this in this is a painting that forms part of a submission that was made by Jack Green, who's an artist from Western Australia. And it's an absolutely amazing set of paintings. Jack Green is illiterate, and these statements that are, recorded from his words and written next to each of these paintings. And you can see just this absolute demolishing of value statement that we just saw from Rio Tinto in view of a kind of investigation of the background conditions under which this event occurred. And these paintings were submitted to the parliamentary inquiry into that destruction of the Jukan Gorge. So on the right, you can see a line of 5 people, 3 white fellas and 2 black fellas. This represents how mining companies are choosing our people as their representatives. They take our people away from us. The mining company is playing with our law and custom. They're playing with things that are at the heart of our native title, things that are very important to us as Aboriginal people of this land. And he talks about how next to the black fella to the right, there's a dead tree, and that stands for how the law is dead for this group of people. They might as well be dead. They're no longer upholding the law. And then below it, there is this group of black fellas standing together, strong with their law and custom. Above them, there's another tree. This one's alive, and next to it's a water hole with a creek. This is how the land nurtures us when we look after it through our law and ceremony. It gives us life. And on the left, you can see a fella hammering in a nail. You can just see that. You can see 2, I think, a black nail and a white nail. A black fella comes back up like a rusty nail. We always come back. It doesn't matter what white people try to do to us. To take our law, we'll be back. All right. Now, one of the reasons I want to introduce this artwork, and if I have time, a little bit more of Jack Green's work, is I think that it's just an incredibly powerful statement that shows country as part of what it is. It is manifesting, what it's presenting here is country. And it's showing the layers at which this kind of alleged cultural recognition practiced by Rio Tinto can actually be shown to be the condition of exploitation and abuse of these communities, that it is divisive, it actually destroys country, it actually destroys law. Now, I'm going to draw just a few more kind of directions from the literature on epistemological oppression, because I think one of the things that's interesting about the corporate space is if you like, a kind of resilience of the colonial imaginary that's embedded in that kind of value statement, or embedded in the circulation of acknowledgement as a kind of corporate or state kind of document. And if we think about it in terms of it containing a kind of epistemological resilience, so it takes different forms, but underlying it, there's this kind of set of relationships. We've kind of looked at them through the lens of mining as a kind of extractive industry. But what we're also seeing is assumptions that structure certain kinds of knowing practices, ways of knowing Aboriginal people through this lens of cultural recognition and a kind of partnership in building extractive industries. And I'm just drawing here on some directions that we might get from, say, Lorraine's codes, distinction between instituted and instituting imaginaries, and Christy Dodson's kind of idea that within responses to epistemic oppression, we need to be developing the capacity to recognize and alter elements of operative instituted social imaginary. So supposing that's embedded in our existing acknowledgement practices, are there ways in which, through developing abilities to recognize cultural tradition systems that shape those imaginaries, that acknowledgement might become a less deadened, more politically active and interesting kind of practice. And so really, in terms of these implications, I'm just trying to draw some criteria. Acknowledgement should become more reflexive. It should become a place to learn about and recognize colonial imaginaries, as well as speaking to others. And it needs some kind of performance that, again, just enlivens it, brings into the space of this instituting imaginary, rather than simply repeating a form that is so deadening. Oh.
That's not me.
Was that I'm out of time sign? So I'm going to try and go through this really fast. So look, one of the ideas that I think I find really valuable in the epistemic oppression literature is that it's not just about trying to recenter voices that are marginalized, which I take it is kind of a very similar gesture to the kind of politics of recognition, right? That you're trying to bring into a sort of pre-existing political community, some voices that may disrupt it, but they're essentially being brought in. The aspect of epistemic oppression analysis that I'm finding more helpful is the idea of it functioning as a kind of epistemic oppression functioning as a kind of foreclosure, and the foreclosure of alternatives. And so here are just some criteria I'm kind of playing with for resisting colonial epistemology within acknowledgement. They might involve activating and instituting imaginary. They obviously involve some kind of critique of the colonial frame, and they involve resisting a certain foreclosure of knowledge. And in addition to that, I think something to do with bringing this back to country as a site of law and of expressive and transformative practice, the sort of thing that we saw actually being enacted in that painting by Jack Green. I think that's a really good thing to think about alongside this as well. That went through that slide much faster than I was planning. So look, let's just very briefly consider a kind of structure of foreclosure here. So how does settler colonial epistemology foreclose country? And we've got these various processes of translation and retroactivity that I think are really salient to what we've just kind of witnessed in both the Rio Tinto example and the kind of pushback that is given it by Jack Green's work. So we've got a kind of understanding of country as kind of place-based, grounded normativity, law being the kind of framework that someone like Jack Green is referring to. And this is co-opted into the struggle for land rights, turned into a sort of site where there'll be a struggle over material resources, what can be extracted. So to summarize, to engage with the process of negotiating a land claim agreement, First Nations people must first translate their complex reciprocal relation with the land into the complex but different language of property. And then you have this kind of retroactivity whereby we reallocate to the dispossessed who've had their land as law turned into land as property. They are now recognized as the original owners or custodians of that land. And in that process, there's been this fundamental transmutation. This is the kind of, this is another version of the critique in terms of what the politics of recognition achieves. And you see a really clear example of here, again, of the way in which recognition functions as a field of power through which colonial relations get reproduced and maintained. Now, if we take that as a kind of process of foreclosure, I'm interested in, as it were, framings that can link the kind of critique of the colonial imaginary or spend time actually looking at the frame of the colonial imaginary and how it is reproduced into the present, and to understand this as a kind of process of translation that is ongoing and is being resisted in various ways. And what I've juxtaposed here is a famous set of proclamation boards that were created in 1830 by the then governor of New South Wales, Governor Arthur. And this was a way of speaking to the Aborigines about their equality under the rule of law. And you see here in all of these proclamation boards, this very central figure of the handshake between the representative of the Aboriginal people and the representative of the colonial forces, with this kind of promise built into the narrative that if you accept the rule of law, you will be just as protected underneath it as the white fellas are, that there's this promise of equality. And it was amazing to me when I saw these Jack Green paintings, how closely those images are actually reproduced in this work that is representing a similarly treacherous kind of handshake, a similarly treacherous kind of moment of social contract. And one of the ways in which we can analyze this is through the kind of resistance that is presented in Jack Green's painting by virtue of trying to present an account of country, of land as a site of law, of dwelling, of nurture, that fundamentally contests the whole kind of framework of political representation that is represented by the capacity for certain individuals to speak on behalf of the Aboriginal nation as a way of negotiating deals with mining companies. What you see in Jack Green's paintings are this extraordinary kind of depiction of the ongoing frontier wars of Australia, but fought in terms of dollars. This kind of sense that this is transaction around the buying of rights to mining that is, on Jack Green's account, completely destroying country. And I'll end with that by talking just for a moment about this work, which again is part of this submission to Parliament. And I think it's an extraordinary work because, I mean, on the one hand, we have this statement that he makes about what country means to his people, what it means to be under law. But alongside it, he creates this painting, which is doing this really interesting work of petition, in that it is showing, it's obviously continuous with the kind of body painting that is the site of ceremonial art and law in Aboriginal cultures. And it's putting his body in the place of country. But it's showing in this really like translated way, it's translating that into this kind of plea, but also, you know, trying to show it in a way that the stupid white people will understand what this means. So I think it's a really interesting site to think about this space of translation. I've got stuff on retroactivity as well, but we don't have time.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
So we have time for questions. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Let me share this brief story with you. I was at a conference in the University of Ottawa a few years ago. I was new to Canada, and everybody was doing an acknowledgement. It was in the law school. And I asked, I don't know what, so I asked the organizers, where can I find Indigenous people? And they told me, only the market drunk. And I was shocked, but they just said this in a neutral way. I was like, okay, and everybody was doing a land acknowledgement. And then they had a whole panel on Indigenous property rights. You want to guess who wasn't part of the panel? A single Indigenous person. And everybody kept doing land acknowledgements. So I stood there and I was like, I'm not going to do land acknowledgement here because you're all insane. I'm like, you are having all these conversations about Indigenous people on Indigenous land, giving a land acknowledgement that you clearly don't care about. But what's the point? I have a lot of feelings. I didn't get invited again to that conference, but that's why I don't fit well in law school. But it just becomes this completely performative action. And I have a lot of Indigenous students in Alberta. I ask them, how do you feel about land acknowledgements? You know, they're like, if people mean it, it's great. But that becomes a problem, right? That if it's just this performative action that a lot of people in Canada do as performative because it's part of the practice, then it's completely pointless. The epistemic system is just protecting itself. Okay, instrumentalizing this thing. There's no critical analysis there. It's just something that you have to get done with. Even colleagues of mine in Canada will just make the land acknowledgement without a second thought about it. Right? So I grew up next to Indigenous people, so I'm like, where are they? And that question is the one that I think should be placed at every instance. It's like, I'm doing a land acknowledgement. Where's the Indigenous people? So if it's not coming with that acknowledgement that it's not about the land, it's about the people, then I think we're missing the point. Sorry, this is just.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think that's where I actually think it's interesting as well to sort of think about. that idea of country is actually quite a rich one too. I mean, the fact that we're talking about acknowledgement of country, and that is an acknowledgement of something that's more than land and may not be reducible to land. I mean, I think that's an important, you know, that's a space in which you might do some work. But I mean, yes, absolutely. You know, is it just for white people to feel good? I mean, it's always the question about acknowledgement. It's also a question how you know, when you try to make it more sincere, or you try to show that you feel it or mean it, that in itself can become just a very kind of self-referential sort of gesture. So, you know, I mean, one of the beginnings of this kind of work I've been doing was when I started experimenting with actually deepening and extending acknowledgement practices, because we were required by the university to give acknowledgements at the start of our lectures. And it was a weird kind of, you know, if you have this kind of criticism in your mind, it's a very weird thing to be doing. And so I started working with showing artworks in that context, and spending really the whole time that we were together talking about what the work showed in terms of what we were acknowledging, what we might be acknowledging, what kind of histories we might be acknowledging, what people we might be acknowledging, what that would mean, and linking it into the things that we were talking about otherwise in the class. This was a class on feminist gender theory. And that was just an incredibly rich experience. And I know the students felt that they learned and thought a lot about things that, you know, otherwise just have no kind of depth of engagement in the acknowledgement. And I think that that's, you know, it's just, I would have liked to, if I'd balanced my time use better, I would have liked to spend more time with these works, because I think, you know, some of the things that Jose was talking about this morning, you know, there's a kind of affectivity that's really important here as well. There's a kind of time of spending, you know, with complex stories, and the kind of relationships that artworks can invite you into. And I think, you know, it's not perfect, but it's a really interesting space for at least developing the kind of the critical and kind of relational capacities of acknowledgement, and contesting this kind of, you know, very restrictive epistemological framing.
There's a question by Karine Miller.
Bonjour, hi, thank you for your presentation. I felt like I read myself on an acknowledgement, and as someone who's a member of the One Nation, and with my colleague Annie Pollen, we are both from the University of Montreal. I'm faculty of law, she's in social sciences. We asked ourselves, well, instead of, because I think that it's really important to do a critique of land acknowledgements, but we ask ourselves, at the end of the day, what should we say to people who have to do it, or ask ourselves the question, should I do it? And how should I do it? And we found that perhaps instead of just, you know, do a critique, it was a better idea to suggest very practical guidance for people, normative guidance to the way that we should do those land acknowledgements. And we also work with a group of others and knowledge keepers regarding that. And so I'd like to, and so I found your analysis very interesting, but I'd like to know if you would have to, you know, to summarize and to answer this very practical question that we all have at the end of the day. Should we do a land acknowledgement? And how should we do it to really be respectful? So that's my first part of the question. And the second part of the question is also a comment. Is like at some point you compare this exercise, like, well, you say that it was a debate or a matter, an issue of property rights, you know, property debates versus racism debates. And well, it seems to me that it's not about property, it's about responsibility to the land, to nature, and to the people.
Yeah.
And don't you think that actually a land acknowledgement could be a good way for non-Indigenous people just to really acknowledge too that beyond the land and the territory, we are from, like, we have different visions of the world, and we're not even talking about property. And this is why it's like unseat territory.
Yeah.
Because actually we don't even talk about property. It's a question of responsibility. So it's beyond like who has the property. It's just like we have different visions of it.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so that's the second point you make is exactly the one I was trying to work towards. I mean, you put it much more succinctly than me, but yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that is where, you know, I gave a couple of I mean, besides this kind of critique aspect, this idea of kind of somehow recentering the idea of country and how you might do that is perhaps part of my answer to the first question as well, that respect is, it really matters in what way that is cast in terms of a genuine appreciation of aspects of Aboriginal value systems and ways of being that are going beyond some of the terms that you're offering in the sort of more conventional forms of recognition. So look, I often do acknowledgements of country despite all these qualms, but I do think it's a huge issue for us now in view of this kind of corporatization and kind of the failure of the progressive politics around acknowledgement. I don't think it's a straightforward thing anymore to do. And I do think that your questions about, well, how do you show respect? They're exactly the right ones. And I'm still grappling with, you know, what people should do. I think there's a lot of context that's important. And maybe what's important is how you reference that context and circulate more awareness and reflection around that. I mean, it's part of the sort of subtitle of the staging of history. I mean, that's part of what I'm trying to explore here as something that can be a kind of performative space in which your acknowledgement takes on something of that sort of that aspect, if you like, of the instituting imaginary that says things are now, things matter now, and you have to think about how you're performing this in such a way that you take ownership of that. I mean, another way I've thought about this is in terms of, you know, the sort of idea that you're somehow echoing Aboriginal practices of the kind of way in which you acknowledge country when you're going onto someone else's land. And I think a nice way to think about that is that you're at some kind of threshold, right? And the question of what happens at that threshold is a little bit uncertain, should be a little bit uncertain. It shouldn't just be a kind of script that you follow. It's something where you should be recognizing other worlds, if you like, as part of that encounter. And so, yeah, I mean, I think those are ways of reflecting on the kind of performativity of your utterance they're not about the mere performativity of your utterance.
Thank you. We have, I think, time for one last question.
Just as a preface, I want to say I love art, I really do. But in the context of epistemic oppression, I wonder what kind of role or what are the conditions in which art could serve the prolongation of temporality and emotion. I guess one of the main critiques that you've had about acknowledgement is not that it's insincere only, but that it doesn't last and it has no impact, right? And your understanding of art is that it provides some sort of like an alternative narrative that engages people in order to understand, as you said, the context wherein these acknowledgements become, insincere, and it doesn't perform what it aims to achieve. Thank you. Yes. So in this context, how do you understand the role of art in actually achieving this? Because I can imagine that you don't want to rely on the elitist narrative where there's somebody who is explaining what this art is trying to achieve. Or you don't want to fall back on other types of voices that have credibility, such as yourself, where you explain why this artwork is important, or impactful, right? I feel like even if you were to fulfill the conditions of narrative that really situates art in a poignant way, how it touches people will be so radically different compared to those who are members of Aboriginal people to the whites, right? So how do you then nuance the ways in which you attempt to get to where you want to go, which is the temporality issue, right? I wanted to hear more about it.
Okay, so I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about there's a huge body of art by Aboriginal artists that's engaging critically with colonial imaginaries. I was going to show a couple of examples. So here's a famous painting of Captain Cook planting the flag, and it has this very curious figure in the center. It's totally kind of anachronistic of this black man as a servant. It's anachronistic in lots of respect, but anachronism in a way is kind of the theme that's sort of teased out by this famous painting by Gordon Bennett, in which he kind of centers a detail of that painting and kind of makes it clear, makes visible a kind of anachronism of the painting. And I think there are very sophisticated ways in which Aboriginal artists are dealing with these questions of colonial time, the sort of ways in which this stands for the kind of legal fiction of founding the kind of authority of the British over the Australian continent. I don't think it's imposing on these artworks to show them and relay artist statements. Is often what I'm doing with these works, that are themselves commentaries, really, really powerful political commentaries on the kind of framework in which you engage with the process of acknowledgement. So I mean, I take your point. It's a risky business that you're there kind of, being the one who interprets the work. But very often there are very sophisticated and interesting artist statements, or you have someone like Richard Bell, who I was showing earlier, who speaks for himself. I mean, those are amazing pieces of political art. And I think there's a huge value to taking the opportunity to center something that makes you spend time thinking. I suppose that's all I'm claiming about that's a kind of interruption in your routine that they bring. And I think that's really valuable.
So thank you so much for your talk and this